At some point, the pain didn't explode. It didn't break you, it simply went quiet. You didn't stop feeling because life got easier. You stopped feeling because it got heavier. And your mind, trying to protect you, made a decision without asking for your permission. This is emotional numbness, and it is not weakness. From a psychological perspective, emotional numbness is a survival response. When emotions become too intense, too frequent, or too overwhelming, the nervous system looks for relief. If it can't escape the situation, it disconnects from the feeling. Not permanently, just enough to keep you functioning. Dark psychology describes this as emotional shutdown, a state where the mind reduces emotional input to avoid overload. Much like physical pain, emotions have a threshold. When that threshold is crossed repeatedly, the brain doesn't become stronger, it becomes quieter. This is why numbness often follows long periods of stress, anxiety, disappointment, or emotional responsibility. You didn't shut down because you didn't care. You shut down because you cared for too long without recovery. Biologically, the body knows only one priority: survival. When emotions threaten stability, the system adapts. Fight and flight are obvious responses. Freeze is quieter. Numbness is quieter still. It allows you to move through life without constantly bleeding internally. But the cost of this adaptation is subtle. You don't just lose pain, you lose contrast. Joy feels muted. Excitement feels distant. Even sadness feels flat. Life continues, but it feels like you're watching it through a layer of glass. Many people misunderstand this state. They think something is wrong with them. They try to force emotions back, to feel more, care more, react more. But numbness isn't a lack of emotion. It's a protective pause, a signal that your system has been under pressure for too long. If this description feels uncomfortably familiar, pause here. And if this kind of psychological clarity helps you understand your inner state, consider liking the video and subscribing. This channel exists to explain what your mind is doing, not to judge it. Because numbness is not the problem. It is the solution your mind chose when nothing else worked. The real question isn't why you feel numb. It's what your system was trying to protect you from. And to answer that, we have to look at what happens when emotions aren't processed, only pushed aside. That's where the next chapter begins. If emotional numbness is the mind's emergency brake, suppression is the long road that leads to it. This is where feelings don't disappear. They accumulate, quietly, invisibly, until the system can no longer carry the weight. Suppressing emotions is often mistaken for strength. You learn to stay composed, to move on quickly, to not dwell. Somewhere along the way you internalize the idea that emotions are distractions, that feeling less will help you function better, and for a while it works. But psychology tells a different story. When emotions are not processed, they don't dissolve. They are stored. The body remembers what the mind avoids. Each ignored feeling adds pressure, like air slowly filling a sealed container. You may not notice it day to day, but the tension builds beneath the surface. Dark psychology explains suppression as a control strategy. Instead of allowing emotions to move through you, you hold them down to maintain stability. This often develops in people who had to be emotionally responsible early in life, those who learned that expressing feelings created problems instead of solutions. Over time, suppression changes your internal landscape. Emotional range narrows. Reactions flatten. You stop feeling highs and lows. Not because life became neutral, but because your system learned that feeling deeply was unsafe or exhausting. This is where psychological shutdown begins. Shutdown is not depression. It's not sadness. It's the absence of emotional signal. The mind, overwhelmed by unresolved internal pressure, reduces emotional output to maintain function. You can still think, you can still work, you can still interact. But emotionally, something feels distant. Many people describe this state with phrases like, "I know I should feel something, but I don't," or "I feel empty, not sad." That emptiness is not nothing, it's containment. What makes this process especially confusing is that suppression often looks like maturity from the outside. You seem calm, stable, unbothered. Inside, however, the lack of emotional flow slowly disconnects you from yourself. You stop responding to your own signals because you've trained yourself not to hear them. Dark psychology emphasizes this point. Emotions are not obstacles to thinking. They are data. When you block emotional data for too long, decision-making becomes disconnected from meaning. You may function efficiently, but without direction or desire. And that's when the question starts to form quietly in the background. Why don't I feel like myself anymore? That question doesn't come from sadness. It comes from disconnection. Because when emotions are suppressed long enough, they don't just shut down pain, they shut down identity. And that shift from emotional containment to loss of self-connection is where the next chapter takes us. When emotional suppression turns into numbness, the first thing you lose is not happiness, it's clarity. You begin to drift away from yourself without realizing it, like a signal slowly fading into static. At this stage, people often say, "I don't know what I want anymore." Not because they lack intelligence or goals, but because emotions are the compass that give direction to thought. When feelings go quiet, desire becomes vague, motivation weakens, decisions feel arbitrary. Dark psychology describes this state as emotional disconnection, not in a dramatic sense, but in a functional one. You can still think, reason, and plan, but those processes feel detached from meaning. You may go through routines, accomplish tasks, and even succeed externally while internally feeling strangely absent. This is why numbness often comes with a loss of interest. Things that once mattered now feel neutral. Hobbies lose their pull. Achievements feel hollow. It's not that you've become lazy or ungrateful. It's that emotional feedback, the sense of this matters to me, has been muted. As this continues, your relationship with yourself changes. Instead of asking, "What do I feel?" you start asking, What should I feel?" Your inner life becomes theoretical. You analyze yourself instead of experiencing yourself. This creates distance, and distance deepens the numbness. Many people confuse this with personal failure. They assume they've lost passion, depth, or authenticity. But psychologically, what's happening is simpler and more unsettling. You've adapted so well to not feeling that you've forgotten how to listen inwardly. Dark psychology points out that this resembles mild dissociation, even when there is no major trauma. It's not about escaping reality, but about reducing internal noise. The mind chooses neutrality because neutrality feels safer than emotional volatility. The danger of this state is subtle. You may function well enough that no one notices anything wrong, not even you, but beneath that surface, you feel disconnected from your own reactions. You stop trusting your inner signals because they no longer feel reliable or strong. This is often when people say, "I feel like I'm watching my life instead of living it." Experiences happen, but they don't land. Time passes, but it doesn't register emotionally. You are present, but not fully there. What makes this particularly painful is that numbness protects you from pain, but it also protects you from connection, to yourself first and then to others. And once that internal connection weakens, it becomes difficult to form deep emotional bonds externally, because how you relate to yourself shapes how you relate to everyone else. And when numbness takes hold internally, it doesn't stay contained. It quietly changes how you show up in relationships. That outward shift, how emotional numbness spreads beyond you and into your connections with others, is where the next chapter begins. When emotional numbness disconnects you from yourself, it inevitably reaches outward. Relationships begin to change, not dramatically, but subtly. Conversations still happen, connections still exist, yet something essential feels missing, even if no one can quite name it. Emotionally numb people often describe feeling distant even when they are physically present. You listen, respond, and show up, but the emotional current that once flowed between you and others feels weak or absent. This isn't indifference, it's disconnection. And from the outside, the two can look almost identical. Dark psychology explains that emotional presence is what creates depth in relationships. It's not words or actions alone, but emotional responsiveness, the ability to feel with someone. When numbness dulls that responsiveness, interactions become flatter. You may care deeply, but your reactions don't fully reflect it. This creates confusion on both sides. Others may sense the distance and misinterpret it. They may assume you're uninterested, withdrawn, or emotionally unavailable. Some pull away quietly. Others push harder, asking what's wrong. And because you don't feel anything clearly yourself, you struggle to explain what's happening. In close relationships, this often leads to guilt. You notice that you're not reacting the way you should. You don't feel excited, angry, or affectionate in the expected ways, so you compensate. You perform concern. You mimic emotional responses. Over time, this emotional acting becomes exhausting. Numbness also changes how conflict is handled. Instead of engaging emotionally, you detach. Arguments feel distant. Problems don't provoke urgency. While this can appear calm or mature, it often prevents real resolution. Issues remain unresolved, not because they don't matter, but because they don't register emotionally. Dark psychology highlights a painful paradox here. Emotional numbness protects you from relational pain, but it also prevents relational intimacy. You avoid being hurt, but you also avoid being deeply touched. Safety increases, but closeness fades. This is especially isolating because numbness is invisible. You're still there, still reliable, still present, yet you feel alone even around people who care about you. That loneliness doesn't come from rejection. It comes from emotional distance. Over time, relationships may start to feel draining rather than nourishing. Social interaction requires effort, not because others demand too much, but because emotional engagement feels forced. Withdrawal begins quietly. You say no more often. You need more space. Silence feels easier than connection, and eventually a quiet realization sets in. It's not just people that feel distant. You feel distant from life itself. This is the point where numbness stops being just emotional and becomes physical and mental exhaustion. Because maintaining connection without emotional energy is unsustainable. That slow depletion, the cost of staying emotionally on while feeling emotionally off, is where the next chapter begins. When emotional numbness lingers long enough, it doesn't remain isolated in your feelings or relationships. It spreads into your mental and physical energy. This is where burnout quietly takes root. Not the dramatic kind that forces you to stop, but the slow kind that drains you while you keep going. Emotional burnout is often misunderstood as laziness or lack of motivation. In reality, it is depletion. You have been emotionally on for too long, managing stress, expectations, responsibilities, and internal pressure without true recovery. Eventually, the system looks for a way to conserve energy. Numbness becomes that strategy. Dark psychology explains that overthinking plays a critical role here. When emotions feel unsafe or overwhelming, the mind takes over. You analyze instead of feel. You think instead of process. Overthinking becomes a way to stay functional while avoiding emotional overload. It feels controlled, but it's exhausting. This is why many emotionally numb people also feel mentally tired. Their minds never truly rest. Thoughts loop, replaying past conversations, anticipating future problems, scanning for potential threats. Even in moments of quiet, the brain stays alert. There is no psychological off switch. Over time, this constant mental activity drains emotional reserves even further. The body stays in a low-level stress response. Sleep doesn't feel restorative. Rest feels shallow. You may feel tired even after doing very little because your energy is being spent internally. What makes this stage especially confusing is that burnout doesn't always feel painful. Sometimes it feels empty. You don't feel extreme sadness or anxiety. You feel flat, neutral, disengaged. This emotional flatness is often the final layer of protection when anxiety and stress have already done their damage. Burnout also changes your relationship with effort. Tasks that once felt manageable now feel heavy. Decisions feel draining. Even small responsibilities require mental preparation. You may procrastinate not because you don't care, but because your system is conserving what little energy remains. Dark psychology emphasizes an important truth here. Numbness is not the opposite of anxiety. It is often what comes after it. When the mind can no longer sustain constant alertness, it shuts down emotional output to survive. At this point, many people begin to worry that something is permanently broken. They wonder if they'll ever feel normal again. But numbness at this stage is not a dead end. It's a signal, a sign that your system has reached its limit. The critical mistake is trying to push through it the same way you pushed through stress before. More effort doesn't restore feeling. More thinking doesn't create relief. What's needed now is not force, but safety, because emotional energy doesn't return through pressure. It returns through permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to feel gradually. Permission to stop fighting your internal state. And that realization leads to the most important question of all. If numbness is protection, not failure, how do you begin to feel again without overwhelming yourself? That answer, gentle, slow, and counterintuitive, is where the final chapter begins. If emotional numbness is protection, then healing is not about breaking that protection, it's about making it unnecessary. This is where many people go wrong. They try to force feeling back. They push themselves to care more, react more, feel something, anything. But pressure is often what created numbness in the first place. Dark psychology makes this clear. Emotions return through safety, not demand. When your system shut down, it wasn't punishing you. It was conserving energy. So the way forward isn't intensity, it's permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to feel in fragments. Permission to exist without constantly managing yourself. Reconnection begins subtly, not with joy, but with neutrality that feels a little less empty. You may notice small moments of irritation, warmth, curiosity, or sadness. These aren't setbacks, they're signals. Feeling returns unevenly, not all at once. One of the most important shifts is learning to tolerate emotion without immediately analyzing it. Overthinking was a tool you used to stay functional. Now it's time to loosen its grip. When a feeling appears, even faintly, let it exist without explanation. You don't need to understand it to allow it. The body plays a crucial role here. Emotional numbness lives as much in the nervous system as in the mind. Gentle physical grounding, walking, breathing slowly, noticing sensations, helps signal safety where words cannot. This isn't about fixing yourself. It's about reminding your system that the present moment is not a threat. Another key element is reducing emotional performance. You don't need to react the way you think you should. Authentic feeling grows when you stop monitoring yourself. When you stop asking, is this enough? Is this right? And start allowing whatever is there to be sufficient. Dark psychology emphasizes something often overlooked. Numbness recedes when control loosens. The more you try to manage your inner state, the more distance you create. When you allow uncertainty, emotion finds space to move again. This process requires patience. Emotional reconnection is not linear. Some days you'll feel more, other days less. That doesn't mean you're regressing, it means your system is recalibrating. Trust is being rebuilt, not just with others, but with yourself. Over time, meaning returns quietly, not as intensity, but as resonance. You start to care again, not urgently, but honestly. Life feels less distant, not perfect, but present. And this is the final truth of emotional numbness. You didn't lose your ability to feel, you paused it to survive. Now, by creating safety instead of pressure, presence instead of performance, and permission instead of force, you allow what was frozen to thaw, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently and sustainably. That is how feeling comes back, not as an obligation, but as a natural response to finally being allowed to rest.